interest groups are a critical component of democracy. They're a product of the First Amendment right to freedom of association. By banding together around common concerns, people can express their voice to government clearly and directly. But the interest group system, as it has evolved in the United States, also has some very problematic aspects to it. So let's get a little bit of a philosophical grounding in this particular type of political organization. From the time of the country's founding, interest groups have existed and been seen as a problematic force in politics. At that time, rather than calling them interest groups specifically, they were generally lumped into a broader category called factions. The drafters of the United States Constitution worried about their impact. James Madison, in particular, was quite concerned about them and described them as such in Federalist No. 10, an essay in support of ratifying the Constitution. He described factions as a number of citizens who are united by some common impulse or passion, or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So Madison worried about groups of citizens banding together to protect their own particular interests at the expense of the greater common good. Very much the way we might think about interest groups today when we attach the modifier special in front of them. Special interest groups gets at this idea of harmful organizations that get favorable treatment from government in ways that are harmful to society at large. The question then, and now, is what can you do about them? According to Madison, not too much. He saw factionalism as an inherent part of human nature. People have different interests based on their occupations, their financial status, where they happen to live, their religious beliefs, etc. And even beyond that, Madison noted that even people who share almost everything in common still tend to find some way to disagree and break into competing factions. So any remotely complex society is going to have to deal with factionalism. And according to Madison, this factionalism is a necessary evil in a free society. That liberty means allowing citizens to band together in like-minded groups. He saw government action that sought to suppress factions as being a cure that's worse than the disease. So to him, the best solution was to allow these groups to operate freely in a large republic where many different organized factions would compete with one another for power. Since so many interests are engaged in this process, the idea is that no single interest will gain too much control, that in other words, a rough balance of power will be achieved. This is essentially the underpinning of pluralism, one of the major theories about how American politics actually works. Pluralism argues that American politics is the politics of group interests, that the way the public will is expressed is through thousands of different groups, each competing to have their particular concerns addressed by government. Madison's recognition of factions as an insuppressible force have been borne out through the years. The French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville, who was such a keen observer of American political culture, noted in Democracy in America how particularly likely Americans were to form political groups. He says, in the United States, as soon as several inhabitants have taken an opinion or an idea they wish to promote in society, they seek each other out and unite together once they have made contact. From that moment, they are no longer isolated, but have become a power seen from afar, whose activities serve as an example and whose words are heeded. These words, printed nearly 2 centuries ago, are, if anything, even more true today than they were at the time they were written. In the United States, groups of like-minded people are constantly forming to have their words heeded, as Tocqueville eloquently stated. This would seem to lend support to the pluralist idea of democracy, that Americans have their voices heard by government through their activities in groups. But pluralism is not without its detractors. Perhaps the most devastating criticism of pluralism came from E. E. Schattschneider, one of the great American political scientists of the 20th century. He argued that pluralist ideals did not even remotely reflect the reality of American politics. Rather than seeing a level playing field in which every group of citizens had an equal opportunity to press their case before government, he argued that interest group power was heavily skewed towards wealthy interests. His main idea is eloquently captured by a quote from his 1960 book, The Semi-Sovereign People, in which he states, "The flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent." Schattschneider noted that wealthy interests had disproportionate power because they had more of the resources that were necessary to succeed in interest group politics. They had more money, obviously, which could be used to build organizational strength and also used to sway government decision makers through things like campaign contributions. They also had greater technical resources, such as professional researchers and legal experts, that allowed them to develop sophisticated policy proposals to advance their interests and to speak the same language, if you will, as government decision makers. And they tended to have social networks that overlapped with government officials, giving them a leg up over poorer interests who did not have such connections. The big idea here is that if government decisions are the product of interest group competition, then government policy is almost always going to be disproportionately favorable to the elite interests in society, and much less representative of the preferences of the majority of the people who are neither rich nor highly educated. For Schattschneider, the solution was to strengthen American political parties as a counterbalance to interest groups. The idea here is that what counts most in parties is numbers, specifically number of voters, rather than money or technical resources. Since parties try to cobble together a majority coalition of voters, they have a much stronger incentive to listen to the voices of the poor and middle class than interest groups do. Schattschneider's ideal of stronger political parties runs against the grain of current public opinion, which views parties quite negatively. But it's worth considering which institutions in American politics are actually most likely to address broader societal concerns.